The soft hum of conversation in a bustling restaurant was abruptly shattered by the sound of raised voices. The clinking of silverware, the laughter of diners, and the warm, welcoming atmosphere all vanished in an instant, replaced by a tense, unbearable silence. A black man, seated at a table enjoying his meal, was suddenly confronted by a hostile figure, the restaurant manager. Without warning, the manager's words cut through the air, their venomous tone aimed squarely at the man. "You need to leave," the manager said, the cruelty in their voice unmistakable. Shocked by the sudden turn of events, the restaurant patrons watched in disbelief as the injustice unfolded before their eyes. In that very moment, the reality of racial discrimination hit home, leaving no room for doubt about the ugly truth, even in places that should be safe and welcoming. Racism can rear its ugly head. This is not just an isolated incident. This is a glaring reminder of the work still to be done in our society to ensure that everyone is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. The man stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing, unsure of how to respond. The looks of the other diners were a mixture of confusion, disbelief, and silent judgment. Some looked down at their plates, pretending not to notice. Others were too afraid to intervene. But the black man, who had just been enjoying a quiet dinner, knew that his rights were being stripped away without cause. His expression hardened, and he stood up, gathering the few belongings he had on the table. "Why? What have I done?" His voice trembled but remained firm, seeking an explanation. The manager's face, now flushed with anger, took a step forward, as if his authority were being challenged. "It's not your business. Just leave." The tension in the air was palpable. For a moment, it seemed as though time had slowed down, the room spinning around him, filled with nothing but the raw sting of injustice. The black man felt the weight of every unfair experience he'd endured throughout his life. But it wasn't just personal anymore. This was about something larger, a moment that would echo beyond the four walls of the restaurant. He refused to back down. "Is this how you treat people?" He looked directly at the other diners, some of whom had started to look uncomfortable, others just staring blankly. "Is this how you allow your manager to behave?" But before the confrontation could escalate further, a voice from the back of the room rang out, a woman, visibly upset, standing up from her seat. "This is wrong," she called out, her face flushed with anger. "What kind of restaurant allows this kind of behavior?" The manager turned sharply, but it was too late. The damage had been done. The woman's words sparked a ripple through the room. More people began to murmur, a few others standing up, some even making their way toward the door, ready to leave. The atmosphere had shifted. The restaurant was no longer a safe haven for anyone who stood by and allowed injustice to go unchallenged. The black man, who had been humiliated and forced to stand alone, now had allies, strangers who were willing to stand with him, to speak out against what was happening. For the first time in what seemed like forever, he didn't feel alone. The restaurant manager, realizing that the situation was spiraling out of control, turned sharply and walked toward the back office, muttering under his breath. In the end, it wasn't just the black man who had been forced out. The manager had lost his dignity, his position, and any claim to respect. As the woman who had spoken out approached the man, she offered a reassuring smile. "You're not alone. None of us should stand by and let this happen," she said quietly. The black man took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the situation start to shift. But his thoughts were still clouded by the emotions of the moment. As the manager disappeared into the back, the room was left buzzing with voices. Some diners whispered amongst themselves, clearly shaken by what they had just witnessed. Others were bold enough to speak out, expressing their anger at the injustice, vowing to take action. The woman who had spoken up earlier stepped forward again, her face resolute. "Are you okay?" she asked gently, her voice soft yet filled with determination. He gave her a small nod, but the anger that had once threatened to consume him was now slowly giving way to a deep sense of exhaustion. "I don't know. It's just too much sometimes. You know, you think that we've moved forward, but then something like this happens, and it hits you all over again, like nothing's changed." She nodded, understanding the pain behind his words, but her eyes shone with a quiet resolve. "Change doesn't happen overnight, but people standing up like this, speaking out, it matters. We can't let this just slide. As the diners continued to murmur, some feeling guilty for not stepping in sooner, the restaurant began to empty. The woman stayed by his side, offering quiet support as they both walked toward the front of the restaurant. The black man was still shaken, but a sense of solidarity had started to replace the isolation he had felt just moments ago. When they reached the front, a police officer arrived. The restaurant had called the authorities to resolve the situation. But the officer, seeing the crowd and the faces of the people who were no longer willing to stand by, hesitated. He took one look at the black man, then at the few patrons still left, and then at the restaurant staff, including the manager who had now appeared from the back office. Looking uneasy, the officer took a step toward the manager. What happened here? The manager stammered for a moment, trying to explain his side of the story, but the murmurs from the patrons only grew louder. He was asked to leave because of the color of his skin. One diner spoke up, her voice trembling with anger. The officer glanced around, his gaze sharp. Is that true? He asked the manager, his tone now serious. The manager faltered, unsure of how to respond with so many people watching. His previous air of authority had all but disappeared. The officer, seeing the situation unfold, turned back to the black man, his face softening. I'm sorry, the officer said, his voice calmer now. This is not how anyone should be treated. You shouldn't have had to go through this. The black man swallowed hard, the weight of the apology doing little to ease the sting. It's not enough to just apologize. This kind of thing happens every day. People don't see the harm until it's right in front of them. The officer nodded, acknowledging the truth in his words. As the manager stood, seemingly trying to compose himself, the woman who had stood up for the black man stepped forward again. I'm not going to let this go. This place needs to be held accountable. We all do, she said, her voice resolute, looking at the officer and then the manager. This isn't over. The black man gave her a long, searching look, feeling something in him shift. A fire had ignited, not just in the room, but within himself. He was no longer just a bystander in his own life. He was part of something larger, a movement that had been built on the backs of countless others who had fought for justice. The officer turned to the manager, his tone becoming more stern. We'll be investigating this. You may be looking at a much larger issue here. A pattern of discrimination cannot and will not be ignored. The manager, realizing the gravity of the situation, dropped his head. The restaurant was not just facing a complaint. It was about to be the center of a broader conversation, one that extended far beyond the walls of this establishment. As the police officer started to take notes and gather statements, the black man turned to the woman, offering her a genuine smile. Thank you. You didn't have to stand up for me. But you did. I don't know what to say. She smiled back, her eyes warm. You don't have to say anything. We're all in this together. As the black man and the woman stepped out of the restaurant, the cool night air hit them both, but it couldn't cool the fire of their emotions. Despite the apology from the officer and the small victory of seeing the manager's authority crumble, the fight wasn't over. I never thought I'd end up in a situation like this, the man murmured, his eyes scanning the street as they walked. But now that it's happened, I can't just walk away. I don't want this to be one of those moments that fades into silence. The woman nodded, understanding. It won't fade, not if we make sure of it. This is about something bigger. We have a chance to make noise, to make change. We can take this further. He stopped walking for a moment, turning to face her. But what if we fail? What if people just move on and forget? It's not the first time this kind of thing has happened. And sometimes, it feels like nothing ever really changes. She paused, considering his words, then placed a hand gently on his shoulder. It's hard, I know, but real change isn't always immediate. It's a long journey, and every time people like you and me stand up, every time we speak out, we push things just a little further. Even if it feels small, it's never small, not when it's happening in the moment. Her words seemed to settle in his chest, though the uncertainty still lingered. You're right, I guess it's just hard to see the long road when you're in the thick of it. Just then, a car honked from behind, pulling them from their thoughts. It was another diner from the restaurant, a man who had been sitting at a table near the front. He rolled down his window and called out to them. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said, his voice sincere. "I'm sorry I didn't step in earlier. I didn't know what to do. But I can't stay quiet anymore. If you're going to fight this, I'll help. I'll make sure people know what happened tonight. You're not alone in this." The black man and the woman exchanged a look. It was the second time in a matter of hours that they'd felt the quiet strength of solidarity rising. "Thank you," the woman replied, her voice full of quiet conviction. "It takes courage to speak out, even in the smallest ways. But we're not going to stop." As the car drove off into the night, the two of them walked in silence for a moment, reflecting on what had just happened. The streets were quieter now, the noise of the evening fading into the distance. "Do you think this will make a difference?" he asked, his voice uncertain but tinged with hope. She smiled, a hint of determination in her eyes. "It already has. Not just because you stood up for yourself, but because you're not letting it end here. Every time someone sees what happened, every time someone speaks out, that's one more step. We'll push this until it's not just about one restaurant or one manager. It's about systemic change. It's about justice." The black man's shoulders relaxed, the weight of the evening slowly lifting. "Then let's make sure they hear us," he said, his voice steady now, as the two of them walked together, side by side. Their resolve hardened, and something shifted within them both. The fight was far from over, but it had begun in earnest, and they would not let it be forgotten. Whether it was through community action, legal battles, or simply refusing to stay silent, the truth was out there now, and they were ready to make sure that it was heard. As the night wore on, the black man and the woman continued walking, their steps growing more synchronized with each passing moment. The weight of the evening still lingered, but the quiet resolve between them was undeniable. The streets were now empty, save for the occasional car passing by. But the silence felt different now, it felt full of possibility. They reached a small park, the benches lit by the soft glow of street lamps. The woman turned to him and paused for a moment, as though weighing her words. "People need to know that this isn't just an isolated incident," she said, her voice softer now but still full of determination. "Racism is systemic. It's in the little things, the moments when we let it slide. But if we stand up, if we speak out, it changes things." He nodded, understanding the depth of what she was saying. His anger from earlier had transformed into something deeper, something more resilient. "I don't want this to just be another story that fades away," he said. "I want it to matter. I want people to see that this is still happening, that we're still fighting for something that should have been settled long ago." The woman smiled, the warmth of her words a quiet comfort. "Then let's make sure it doesn't fade. Let's make sure people understand that this is just one story, but that we are part of a bigger movement. A movement that won't stop until we all stand equal." The black man looked up at the stars beginning to twinkle in the sky, their soft light offering a quiet sense of peace. In that moment, he realized something. The fight he had faced earlier in the restaurant wasn't just his alone. It was shared by millions, by every person who had ever faced discrimination and injustice. "Thank you," he said, turning to the woman beside him, "for being there tonight, for not letting me be alone in this." She placed a hand on his shoulder once more, offering a quiet, affirming nod. "We're never alone, not as long as we stand together." With those words, they stood there for a moment longer, both letting the weight of the night settle in. The world was still full of injustice, but they knew something had shifted. They had sparked a fire, and that fire was only going to grow. They parted ways soon after, knowing that this wasn't the end of their journey, but rather the start of something much larger. The black man made his way home, his mind racing with thoughts of the future, the steps he would take, the people he would connect with, and the change he would help create. The next day, the story of what had happened at the restaurant began to spread. News outlets picked it up, and soon enough, the story was being shared on social media, sparking conversations far beyond the restaurant's walls. What had seemed like an isolated moment of injustice was now a call to action. A moment that would resonate with people across the country. The restaurant faced backlash, and the manager, once so sure of his power, was fired. The community rallied behind the man who had been unjustly targeted, offering support and solidarity. People began to demand accountability. Not just from that one restaurant, but from institutions everywhere that allowed racism to persist unchecked. As for the black man, he became a symbol, not just of the hurt that still existed, but of the power of standing up, of making sure that the voices of the oppressed would no longer be ignored. And with every voice that joined the cause, every story that was told, the message grew louder. Racism would not be tolerated. And together, they would bring about change. And so, the movement continued. From that night on, people were reminded that no one was alone in this fight. The road was long, but they would walk it together, until justice was not just an ideal, but a reality. Thank you so much for watching this video. Your support means the world to us. And we hope this story resonated with you. If you believe in standing up for what's right and being part of a positive change, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. By subscribing, you'll be joining a community that's committed to making a difference and sharing important stories. Together, we can continue to raise our voices for justice. Thank you again, and we'll see you in the next video.